All right. Hello, everyone. This is our first part of our first lesson in United States history. So, what I want you to do is on your notes, whether they be assigned online or you're doing them in your notebook, this is how we're going to do them. It's called Cornell Notes, and they get divided up in this way. So, here's the formatting. At the top, you're going to put the unit title, section title, and the essential question. You can find all of those things on the very first slide of the notes for every lesson that we do. So for instance, at the top of your page in your notes, you're going to write Unit 1, Foundations, which means like foundations of the United States, what we are founded on. We're going to, in this lesson, talk about the beginning of our country. Section 1, which means Lesson 1, the American Revolution. And then you're going to write the essential question, or it's the EQ. You will write, what were the causes and effects of the American Revolution? So that's the top part. Then as you're going through the notes, you're going to worry about this left side, but just for right now, if you're doing this on notebook paper, draw a line down the side of your paper. Do it about maybe 1.5 inches, 2 inches from the left, so the left-hand margin, and then a little bit more. That's going to be where you put your subtitles, your topics, kind of help you to organize your notes. It's called chunking. You take like a paragraph and you say what that paragraph is about, or you take a chunk of the notes and you say what that's about. That's why we call it chunking. So that's kind of where you take notes on your notes. That's for you. Now, this big part on the right, that's where you're actually going to be writing your notes. And you can write them however you want, but I think the easiest way for my class for US history would be to just write them as you see them, like bulleted. So for instance, here's the first page of our notes. So you would write causes, and then you do the bullet point, and then you just write it just like it appears. You don't have to write it exactly like it appears, but you do need to have all that is up there because we do what's called skeletal notes, which is just like it sounds. It's the bare bones, no extra meat. If you want to add extra meat, you certainly can, but you at least have to have the bones. Now, do you have to write like the graphic organizers and you have to describe the images? No, that's extra, and you're welcome to do that. That's again like the meat. Now, also, I would highly recommend in your right-hand big section of your notes, we're talking about right here, that you use a highlighter if you're doing this on your own notebook paper. Or even if you're doing this on a computer, use the highlighter function and please highlight anything that is bolded because that's going to be a key phrase, a key term, something that is important that you will need to know. So you need to have it highlighted in your notes. That is very, very important. And then finally, at the bottom of your page, you're going to have your summary, but please pay attention. You do not need to have this on every page. You only need to have the summary at the end of the lesson. So for instance, we might go through 2 or 3 pages of notes before we finish the lesson. So at the end of that third page, when we finish the notes, that is when you need to have the summary. You do not need to have it on every single page. I have to answer that a lot every year for students. So I hope that makes you feel a little bit better. It's just once per lesson at the end of the lesson. And the summary is super easy. Hi, brother. Want to say hi to all my future students? Okay, go away. That's my little brother. Pandemic, right? But anyway, so the summary is going to answer the essential question, and that's why you wrote the essential question at the beginning of your lesson. So for this one, what you'd be answering is, what were the causes and effects of the American Revolution? And as far as the length of the summary goes, you're writing it at the bottom 5, 6, whatever lines of your bottom of your page. I don't have a set length. It just needs to be long enough to fully answer the question. And I do require that you use proper grammar, use complete sentences, but there is no set number of sentences. You just need to answer the question as fully as you can. And where you'll find the answer is in your notes that you wrote. So that's how we're doing this. It's very easy. It's an easy way to get 100. It counts as a big portion of your grade. So please don't forget to be doing that as you are watching this video. Alrighty, and with all that being said, let's begin. Foundations of our country. This is so important because oftentimes history has been twisted to meet certain people's views and politics. And we want to get to as close as we can to the truth of what our country was founded on. So that's what we're going to look at today. All right, the causes of the American Revolution. Let's just take a step backward. The American Revolution actually was in 1776, but it began well before this. There is not just one cause of the American Revolution. Like you can see in this picture, there are many. So let's go over a few of them. Most of you are aware that our country, long before European settlers and colonists came over, was inhabited by Native Americans. And there was no one Native American group that was in charge. There were many. And then comes the British, comes the French, before them the Spanish. These various groups came over and they put their flag and they said, this is my land. And they made colonies. Like, for instance, remember Spain made New Spain, which was Mexico and Texas and all this big part of the American Southwest. France primarily settled Canada and the Mississippi Valley and Louisiana. And the British, which is going to be important for our story because we are founded primarily from the British 13 colonies, those were on the North American East Coast. And what these colonies were for in the eyes of Britain, the United Kingdom or England, it's the same place, was to be for mercantilism. And mercantilism is the idea that colonies exist to benefit the mother country. So these 13 little colonies over here in the Americas, their purpose was to make Britain richer. And they would do that by feeding Britain their raw materials. This gets into that triangular trade that you probably learned about like in 8th grade. And so America would provide Britain with raw materials such as wood and fish and cotton and indigo and things like that. And in exchange, Britain would provide America with things like finished goods, such as guns and shovels, steel and silver, glass, lead, paint, tea. Okay. That was the idea. And Britain would make a lot of money doing this because they would have a guaranteed market for which to sell their finished goods. So that's the idea. Now, Britain will try to enforce this through the Navigation Acts, and those get largely ignored for a long time, like from the mid 1600s through the next 100 years, the 1760s. America's like, meh, we don't really care. There was lots of smuggling, lots of illegal profiteering going on when people kind of ignored the taxes, ignored the navigation laws. So Britain says, we want you to buy our steel. We want you to buy our metal stuff and our tin and our tea. And America was like, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to buy stuff from the Dutch East Indies. We're going to buy from France. We're going to buy from Spain. They selling it cheaper. That's where we're going to go. It just made sense. And Britain just kind of turned a blind eye because if their colonies were doing well, it kind of made them look good too. They're like a proud mom. Okay, mommy's proud of its colony, even though we were being a little poopy towards them. Okay. But then it can't really be ignored because of this thing called the French and Indian War. And the French and Indian War in 1763 is going to change everything because it cost a lot of money. It's also known as like the first kind of global war. This French and Indian War was not just fought on North America. It was part of the 7 Years' War, which was fought on multiple continents. Where the British were fighting the Spanish and the French all over the world. And it was extremely expensive. And actually, I'm not going to get into it, but the whole thing, this first huge global war is just massive, and it's going to lead directly to the American Revolution and to the United States and everything else. It was started by George Washington. He was like 21 years old out in the Ohio country. And there's like a whole thing there. But yeah, this war cost a lot of money. And so Britain needs to get that money back from her colonies, which is why after the French and Indian War, was over and Britain now had all this new land that they just won from France and stuff, they're going to do several things. First off, they're going to tick off the colonies by passing the proclamation line, there in 1763. Oh, and by the way, the war was earlier. I'm sorry, I messed up on that. But in 1763, the proclamation line is drawn that basically says the colonists are not going to be allowed to go past the Appalachian Mountains. So they just won all this land from the French and Indian War. That they are not allowed to go and plunder and they can't go and settle, which made the colonists really, really angry because a lot of them thought that's what we were fighting for. That's why George Washington had been over there as this young man. The other thing that's going to happen is to get back its money, Britain is going to start to really tax, and here's the key part, enforce those taxes that they kind of been turning a blind eye to before, as far as the colonists go. And so among those taxes that you'll see passed because of this are like the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, where they taxed all sorts of paper goods. Like you would be taxed for playing cards, like Clue and Go Fish and all that. They tax you for having those cards. You'd be taxed for any sort of document, be it like a letter to write home to your mom or just paper you want to doodle on, like any paper document whatsoever, marriage certificates, death certificates, lawyers, contracts, any paper was taxed. And by the way, think about what group this would really annoy. Not just lawyers who you don't want as your enemy because they're, persnickety, but also you have the editors, the newspapermen, the press, who is also another group that you don't really want against you because then they'll write all sorts of bad, negative stuff in their newspapers. And so that was the Stamp Act. Then you're going to have also the Quartering Act. There's actually two of them, and it gets a little wonky, but the main idea here is the Quartering Act said that British troops were allowed to, and were supposed to be able to go and sleep in your homes, that you were supposed to provide lodging for those British soldiers. And that obviously angered many colonists. Now, in reality, it meant that a lot of colonists had to turn over like public buildings to British soldiers for housing. So, like livery stables, warehouses, businesses often were given over to housing the troops, which hurt the bottom line. In so much of what caused the American Revolution, you're going to see that it's not really like the average Joe American colonist who was being directly like put out by the British policies. It's more of like the rich American colonists. And by the way, I mean like we're talking completely about white Americans at this point. African Americans, Hispanic, Native Americans, they have no say during this time. So we're talking about white Americans, but it's really the rich white Americans who are being hurt by the British taxation policies, who are being put out when British soldiers are being, allowed to and being forced to be quartered in their establishments under the Quartering Act. And then Britain's going to pass the Townshend Acts, which is duties or taxes. If you didn't know by this point, also an act is a tax on certain enumerated or like named items. So, for instance, China's famous for its porcelain. That's like fine Chinaware dishes and stuff. That was taxed under the Townshend Acts. You also had glass. You had lead. You had paints. You had paper. And most importantly, tea were all taxed under the Townshend Acts. You also had throughout this time, this is in the late 1760s, you also had the British beginning to do what's called writs of assistance, which were a fancy term for a search warrant. British soldiers would be allowed to board colonial ships whenever they wanted with these little writs of assistance and search for smuggled goods that these rich, businessmen, guys like John Hancock, were trying to smuggle in by getting around the British tax laws. And then if you were caught breaking these tax laws, they caught you using these writs of assistance, then, normally you would go to a trial and it would be a colonial jury, your buddies, people lived in your own town, your peers, who would be the ones judging you under colonial laws, because each colony had its own government. They were locally ruled. They were very independent. but not after the Townshend Acts. That changed that. Now there were the admiralty courts. So if you were accused and caught with some smuggled items breaking these new navigation acts, these taxes, and different laws, then you would be shipped off to like Halifax, Nova Scotia, or even maybe to London, England, across the Atlantic Ocean. That was a trip that took months during this time. You would be shipped over there to have a royal judge basically decide your guilt or innocence. And to make it even worse, and I don't mean to defend these rich, entitled, American colonists, but it was pretty bad what the British were doing. They actually had incentives for the royal judges to decide of the colonists' guilt, because if they decide you were guilty, then the judge got to keep all of the profits from your smuggling, which is like insane. Of course, they're going to decide, oh yeah, you're guilty. Now I'm rich. So it was very, very corrupt. It was very corrupt. And this is at a time when you have over here on this picture, when you have Enlightenment ideas taking root, new ideas about the way people and government should interact, with guys like Thomas Hobbes and his social contract theory saying that governments exist by the will of the people. You have ideas from like British philosophist John Locke, who Thomas Jefferson's going to directly borrow from, that said all people are entitled to life, liberty, and property. You thought I was going to say happiness, didn't you? No, that's added by the Declaration of Independence, but it was stolen directly from John Locke. All people have right to life, liberty, and property. And these various ideas from different English and French and other thinkers at the time. This is the Enlightenment. People are questioning the status quo. People are starting to not be okay with a dominating monarch anymore, a king or queen with total authority. That's not going to fly anymore. People are questioning. People are also questioning because of the Great Awakening, a religious movement in the 1730s and 1740s. That's just a few decades before the revolution happens. This told people that, hey, the king and queen, they're not God. Okay, only you can have a direct relationship with God. And the old idea at this time, divine rights rule, meant that the king and monarch was like the God on earth, basically, in the eyes of many and under the law. The Great Awakening said, question authority, question that. That's not the be all end all. Yeah, to put more emphasis on the individual instead of on the church or state being government. We talked about the independence of the colonies, the French and Indian War, and the restrictive laws. So these are the reasons why the American Revolution is going to happen. Now let's look at like the specific events that lead up to it. You have various colonies, starting with Massachusetts, where Boston was, beginning to boycott these goods that were being taxed under the British laws, such as the Townshend duties. So they're going to boycott all of this porcelain and glass and lead and paper and paint and tea. And they send out committees of correspondence to encourage the other colonies to kind of unify in their boycotts as well. And a boycott is where you refuse to buy something because you're trying to protest it. Probably the most famous example of this is like Rosa Parks, the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. And remember, in that case, that was where Rosa Parks, she refused to get out of her seat because she was protesting the unfair segregation on city buses, that whites were allowed to sit at the front of the bus, but blacks had to sit in the middle and the back. And then that started this boycott that MLK kind of got his name in and helped to organize. And that's where they, for over a year, decided that the African Americans of Montgomery, Alabama, would refuse to ride the buses and show the city the economic trouble that they were in, because that was the majority of those who rode the bus. They were going to be paying those bus tickets, and it really hurt the city not getting that revenue. And finally, they were forced to change their racist segregated seating policy. So again, a boycott, you refuse to buy something to economically hurt them. It's a form of protest. In this case, colonists would refuse to buy these taxed goods that the British were having, such as the tea, to hurt the British and force them to change these policies. Most American colonists, though, I think it should be said, were not like as gung ho, like Sons of Liberty, in favor of doing all this. In fact, most Americans were still kind of pretty loyal to the British. They were called Tories or Loyalists. Um, or they were on the fence, like a lot of us today were like, I kind of like your views, but I kind of like your views, but I don't really know, don't maybe really care as much. That was where most colonists were at. It was really only like maybe less than 40% that were like hardcore, yeah, let's have a revolution, let's boycott, let's do this stuff. But it's those hardcore people that you mainly had like in Boston, and that's where the Boston Tea Party and the earlier Boston Massacre are going to occur. The Boston Massacre took place on March 5th, 1770. I know that date because that is my anniversary. So if I forget it, I'd actually be in trouble with my husband. And in this case, you had at that night, you had British troops that had been sent over to enforce these British taxes and root out smugglers and stuff with writs of assistance. You had like 4,000 British troops that were sent over to Boston, Massachusetts by this point. And this was a city of only like 20,000 at this time. So that's a huge number of soldiers. The city was almost like under martial law because you had like soldiers on every street corner. At their little patrol stations and stuff. And one soldier that was at his duty station, sounds funny, right? Duty station. Anyway, one soldier that was there was being harassed by these kids, these teenagers. They were throwing taunts back and forth, and finally they got into a little fisticuffs, little fight. And the soldier struck the kid, and then the kid called out, and then a whole bunch of people showed up, and the soldier's like totally outnumbered. So he and his friend, they go and they get some reinforcements. So there's like nine or so British soldiers. They were called redcoats because of the coats that they wore. Sometimes they were also nicknamed lobsters, again because like the redcoats. There was 9 British soldiers lined up against this big rowdy crowd of Bostonians. And the Bostonians, they were hurling insults. You dirty lobsters, well, go back to England, won't you? And they were throwing, rocks and all kinds of stuff. They were also, it's March in Boston, so it's still really cold because that's really far north, So they were throwing snowballs at the troops as well, apparently, on this cold March 5th night. And some of the snowballs actually had like oyster shells like inside them. So when the snowball would impact you, you suddenly were getting like rocks and like sharp objects hitting you. So it could actually like really hurt you. And so the crowd was throwing all the stuff at the soldiers. Now there was riots like rules in place, just like there are supposed to be today for soldiers. But I mean, this sounds very familiar, right? With all the protesting we've seen going on, these soldiers are extremely outnumbered by this very rowdy, riotous crowd who's throwing stuff at them. And like a snowball with like these oyster shells hits one of the soldiers. He goes down on his knee, and then maybe like his gun fires. And then in the smoke, because these are old like muskets and stuff, in the smoke that ensues and all the chaos, maybe some of the other soldiers, they're being pelted and they don't know what's going on. They can't hear their commander. They can't see his face because he's kind of in front of them. They think maybe they were supposed to fire because they're under attack. And so then all these guns go off. And when all the smoke clears, there are a few colonists, few Bostonians that are lying on the ground. 3 of them are dead. 2 of them will eventually die later from their wounds. And these 5 are the first casualties in the American War for Independence, the American Revolution. So that is the significance of the Boston Massacre. And what it's going to do is it's really going to galvanize, it's really going to get a lot of American colonists all over the colonies, not just in Boston and Massachusetts, but all over. They're going to get really upset about the British and their taxation. As the Sons of Liberty, we're calling it, this is taxation without representation. We don't have any person representing our interests, our needs over in England, in Parliament, which is the British government. We have been left on our own basically to rule ourselves for over 100 years. And then suddenly now they're telling us what to do. You can't do that. One of the five that was killed, one that was killed instantly, was a 6'2" mulatto man. Mulattoes, what they used to refer to for like a mixed race individual of African American descent. Crispus Attucks was his name, and he was a sailor slash rope maker. It's thought that his ancestry was very mixed. He had an African American mother and his or father, and his mother was Native American from one of the nearby Massachusetts praying towns where they had Christianized natives. So he's half Indian and he's half African American, and he's one of the first people, probably the first person to die at this Boston massacre. So Crispus Attucks, this African American man, is seen as kind of the first person to die for our country, for the United States, because this event is going to directly lead to the American Revolution. Um, Also, Paul Revere, the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere that Longfellow famously wrote about in his poem. Um, Paul Revere was an engraver, a silversmith, famously a horseback rider and stuff, but he was also a son of liberty. And Paul Revere is going to take some various drawings from this event and he's going to publish them. And it's this engraving of the Boston Massacre that becomes very famous, that's sent all over the colonies by those committees of correspondence as they're trying to get people roused up against these dirty Brits. And in this engraving, you could see it looks very one-sided. The British are all lined up very organized, like the captain is not standing in front of them, but is actually behind them. And they're all firing into this crowd of innocent bystanders. Look at all the blood on the ground. So he actually titled this engraving "The Bloody Massacre," which, I mean, if you think of the word massacre, usually you think of like the Indian Wars, you think of mass graves or the Holocaust. This was 5 people that died. There were a few others that were injured, but this is a prime example of propaganda, right? Propaganda. When you have people view or hear or see something that is supposed to make them feel a certain way about something, right? That is propaganda, and that's what Paul Revere did to great effect with his bloody massacre engraving here. So that's the Boston Massacre, and the soldiers actually will end up on trial for murder of these 5 individuals, these 5 colonists that they shot and killed. And the person that will defend these British soldiers on trial is none other than John Adams, our second president, eventually. So John Adams actually defends these people, and it was his own cousin, Samuel Adams, one of the leaders of the Sons of Liberty, who had been, trying to get these soldiers guilty for murder. His cousin John Adams defends them very successfully, showing that the colonists were able to administer justice themselves, because he rightly says, the soldiers were under duress and everything, and the captain gets off with not for murder. I think only 2 of the soldiers were convicted of manslaughter, and their sentences were reduced. I think they had to have like a tattoo done of like an M on one of their fingers or something for manslaughter. But they were trying to show like the colonies could administer justice. Our legal system could work. We had been doing it on our own just fine, in our courts and in our town halls and in our churches and in our assemblies. Our governments had been functioning just fine before the British. We don't need them to, meddle in our affairs. But the British didn't see that. And what they will end up doing after the Boston Massacre is they'll actually they will strip down the Townshend Acts to just one tax left, and that will be the tax on tea. And that is where we will stop our story for today. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I hope that we can talk more about this in part 2 of lesson 1, the American Revolution. Revolution, revolution, revolution.